The whole world once worshipped Paul Newman as the symbol of quintessential masculinity and absolute fidelity. But few suspected that those deep blue eyes had silently recorded the rawest footage of the love lives of his close friends, the uncrowned kings of the silver screen. You think you know everything about James Dean's rebellion? Wait until Paul tells of the nights that bad boy broke down, craving warmth from another man? You assume Marlon Brando was the greatest conqueror of women? The truth about the Godfather's secret gay lover will stun you. And then there is Rock Hudson, the titan who had to hastily marry his secretary to cover up his sexuality, or Cary Grant, the elegant gentleman who lived in the same house with another actor for 12 long years. These are not baseless rumors from the tabloids. This is a shocking revelation that Paul Newman left behind before closing his eyes forever. He wanted to clear the names of 9 talented but ill-fated souls, men who had to wear the suffocating mask of a straight man to survive in the harsh movie capital. Take a deep breath, because what you are about to hear will completely change the way you look at the greatest legends of the 20th century. James Dean, the bad boy yearning for same-sex love. The chilly autumn wind of Connecticut slipped through the window crack, carrying the scent of dry leaves and the dampness of the earth, enveloping the cozy wooden room where Paul Newman sat. At the age of 83, the body of the man once dubbed the sexiest on the planet had now become gaunt due to a vicious battle with lung cancer. Paul sat in his familiar leather armchair, when his legendary blue eyes, the priceless asset that made his brand, now covered by a hazy film of time and painkillers. He stared at the fire crackling in the fireplace, but his mind was drifting back to the dusty, sun-drenched Warner Brothers lot of more than half a century ago. In that flickering firelight, the face of the first person appeared vividly, with messy hair, a red jacket, and a cigarette permanently on his lips. That was James Dean, or Jimmy, as Paul often silently called him. Jimmy was the beginning of all memories, a friend, a rival, and also the biggest obsession of Paul's youth. Paul recalled the year 1954 when they both walked into that fateful audition for the movie East of Eden. At that time, Paul was a disciplined young man, formally trained, while Jimmy was like an untamable wild animal. What Jimmy acted on instinct, from a pain deep within his heart. Paul had observed Jimmy very closely, not just on set but also in everyday moments. He realized that the intense longing for affection in Jimmy's melancholy eyes was never directed at the hot starlets surrounding him, but rather at the men who could give him a sense of protection. Jimmy lived fast, loved in a hurry, and seemed to be constantly running away from himself. Paul remembered the times he caught Jimmy stealing glances at Marlon Brando with eyes full of worship mixed with desire, or the rumors buzzing about Jimmy associating with male producers in exchange for opportunities. But to Paul, that wasn't a dirty trade-off, but Jimmy's way of seeking a little warmth in this cold world. Jimmy was bisexual, or perhaps gay, but trapped in the bad boy image that Hollywood had constructed. He used the speed of race cars to fill the void of loneliness that no woman could touch. Once, Jimmy told Paul in a tiny voice, looking down at the tips of his shoes, "I don't want to live too long, Paul. It's boring as hell." That sentence haunted Paul for the rest of his life. Jimmy seemed to foresee his fate. He lived like a candle burning at both ends, brilliant but brief. Paul always felt guilty, a survivor's guilt, because after Jimmy died in that Porsche 550 Spider, it was Paul who took the roles that should have belonged to Jimmy, such as in the movie Somebody Up There Likes Me. Paul sighed softly, his heavy breathing blending with the popping sound of dry wood. James Dean departed at the age of 24, taking the secret of his true sexuality to the grave, leaving the world an immortal icon. Paul wondered, if Jimmy had lived to this age like him, would he have had the courage to come out as his true self? Or would he still have had to play the role of the flirtatious, rebellious boy until the end of his life? Regardless, in Paul Newman's memory tonight, James Dean was not a sex symbol for girls, but a lonely boy, yearning to love and be loved by men, yet deprived by fate of the right to live his truth too soon. Marlon Brando, the godfather and the urn of his soulmate. The crackling of the dry logs in the fireplace seemed to grow more intense, pulling Paul Newman's mind away from the vague sadness about James Dean to face a real storm. He shuddered slightly, pulling the wool blanket up a little higher, but the chill didn't come from the October weather in Connecticut. No, but from the memory of the greatest and most terrifying man he ever called a colleague, Marlon Brando. If Jimmy was a candle flickering in the wind, then Marlon was an uncontrollable forest fire, incinerating every moral rule of Hollywood at that time. In the flickering light of the fire, Paul recalled the image of young Marlon, a wild beauty, menacing yet lethally charming in the torn t-shirt of a streetcar named Desire. Paul had once been jealous of Marlon. While Paul had to strive for formal education, maintaining the image of a model husband, an elegant blue-eyed gentleman, Marlon lived like a wild beast. He didn't care about public opinion. He slept with whoever he wanted, regardless of whether they were male or female, and he considered that his supreme power. What haunted Paul most wasn't Marlon's long list of lovers, but his courage bordering on arrogance. Paul remembered the day Hollywood was shaken when Marlon casually admitted to a French journalist, "Homosexuality is so much in fashion, it no longer makes news. I have had homosexual experiences, and I am not ashamed." That sentence was like an atomic bomb dropped into the artificially calm lake of the artist's circle. Paul and the men trembling in their narrow closets looked at Marlon with eyes full of both fear and a craving for that freedom. Marlon was the only one who dared to stand at the peak of glory and challenge the whole world about his sexual orientation without anyone daring to overthrow him. But Paul's deepest memory of Marlon was tied to another name, a small man wearing glasses who looked nothing like the majestic godfather, Wally Cox. And the relationship between Marlon Brando, the towering symbol of masculinity, and Wally Cox, the slender comedian, was a sweet mystery that Paul witnessed in silence. They were like two completely opposite puzzle pieces that fit together strangely well. Paul often saw Marlon look at Wally not with the condescending gaze of a star, but with a gentle look, full of protection and reliance. When Wally passed away, Marlon completely collapsed, a breakdown that no tragic role could portray. Paul heard that Marlon kept Wally's urn of ashes in his bedroom for many years, talking to it every night as if his soulmate were still alive. Marlon even left a dying wish for his ashes to be mixed with Wally's and scattered in Death Valley. That wasn't just friendship. That was a profound love that transcended the boundaries of the physical body and prejudice. Paul Newman exhaled, feeling his chest heavy. He looked at his gaunt hands, wondering about the value of the perfection he had preserved all his life. Marlon Brando might have been a madman, a sex addict, a destroyer, but he lived true to his instincts to the very end. He didn't need to play the role of the national husband like Paul. He was the king, and the king does whatever he pleases. In this quiet night, Paul seemed to still hear Marlon's arrogant laughter echoing from the past, mocking the timidity of straight men like him, those who only dared to gaze at freedom from afar, but never dared to touch it. Montgomery Clift, fading beauty and 10 years of self-destruction. The firewood in the fireplace had faded, leaving only faint glowing embers, just like the vitality draining from Paul Newman's aging body. He shuddered slightly, pulling the wool blanket higher, his gaze drifting out the window where the Connecticut night was being covered by a drizzling rain. The sound of rain pattering on the porch reminded him of another man, the one with the saddest eyes he had ever met. Eyes that always welled up as if containing an entire ocean of suffering. That was Montgomery Clift, or Monty, the genius with a beauty fragile as crystal, whom Paul always considered the great loser of their generation. If Marlon Brando was a consuming fire, James Dean was a wild wind, then Monty was an open wound that never healed. Paul remembered the 1950s, when Monty was dubbed the most handsome man in Hollywood. Monty's beauty wasn't the rugged masculine type, but a sophistication sensitive to the point of making the person opposite hold their breath. Paul once admitted to himself that he was jealous of Monty's innate talent. Monty didn't act. He pulled his guts out to live on screen. But behind that aura was a secret weighing on Monty's mind every hour of every minute. He was gay in an era where that was considered a sickness. Paul remembered the lavish parties in Hollywood, where Monty always stood nestled in a hidden corner, his hand trembling holding a glass of wine. He didn't dare look straight into other men's eyes, afraid that his longing gaze would be detected. Monty didn't have Brando's defiance to challenge public opinion. He was weak, sensitive, and always lived in fear of being exposed. Paul often saw Monty whispering with Elizabeth Taylor, the only soulmate who understood and protected him, the woman who acted as a shield for Monty against the malicious spears of gossip. The peak of the tragedy struck on that fateful night in 1956, after a party at Elizabeth Taylor's house. Paul never forgot the shocking news the next morning. Monty had crashed his car into a telephone pole. That face, perfect as a sculpture, had been crushed. Although doctors performed surgery to salvage his looks, the Monty of the past died in that heap of scrap metal. From that moment on, Paul witnessed a slow suicide that lasted for a decade. Monty drowned himself in alcohol and painkillers to escape the cruel reality, where he had just lost his beauty and had to continue hiding his true self. Once, Paul met Monty again on the set of The Misfits. By then, Monty was just a shadow of himself, eyes groggy, gestures clumsy. Paul wanted to walk over and pat his friend on the shoulder, wanted to say a word of comfort, but then stopped. He felt helpless. He saw the ultimate loneliness in Monty's teetering walk. Marilyn Monroe once said a sentence that haunted Paul forever. "He's the only person I know who is in worse shape than I am." That statement was heartbreakingly true. In this cold, rainy night, Paul Newman sighed, a heavy breath mixed with the smell of old tobacco. He knew he was much luckier than Monty. He had Joanne, had a warm family to return to. As for Monty, he departed at the age of 45 in solitude, drained by his own talent and secrets. Monty lived a life of wearing a mask, and only when he took his final breath was the man with the sorrowful eyes truly liberated from the hardest role of his life, the role of a happy man. Rock Hudson, a fake. Wedding to cover the true self. The rain drumming on the roof of the Connecticut house had not yet ceased, but Paul Newman seemed not to hear it anymore. His mind was drifting to the golden years of the 50s, where a figure stood tall, blocking the sun, a giant in both the literal and figurative sense. Rock Hudson. Paul shifted slightly in the armchair, the aching in his bones reminding him of the ravages of time, something even a burly man like Rock couldn't defeat. Paul recalled the first time he met Rock. It was a visual shock. Rock was tall, muscular, with a sunny smile and teeth so white they were surrealistically perfect. If Paul and the actors of his time had to struggle to prove their talent through gritty roles, Rock just needed to stand there, smile, and millions of women would swoon. But with his keen blue eyes, Paul saw an ironic truth behind that glamorous exterior. Rock Hudson was the greatest product and also the most tragic victim of Hollywood's star-making technology. Paul remembered Henry Wilson, the powerful and ruthless manager, the man who molded the naive truck driver Roy Scherer into superstar Rock Hudson. Henry taught Rock how to walk, how to speak and laugh, and most importantly, how to love women in front of the camera. Paul once shuddered witnessing Rock having to play the love-struck man in romantic comedies with Doris Day, while his heart throbbed for the muscular young men at the gym. And it was a play that Rock was forced to perform 24/7 with no intermission. The most painful memory to come flooding back was Rock's hasty wedding to Phyllis Gates, Henry Wilson's own secretary, in 1955. Paul knew well that it wasn't the result of love, but a desperate move to silence Confidential magazine, which was threatening to expose Rock's true sexuality. Paul remembered looking at the wedding photo in the newspaper, seeing Rock's forced smile and the bewildered look of the bride. That was the height of deception. Rock had to sacrifice personal happiness, dragging the entire life of an innocent woman into tragedy, just to maintain the title of America's dream lover. Time passed, and that secret was finally exposed in the cruelest way. Paul recalled 1985 seeing Rock on television. It no longer the muscular young man of years past, but a gaunt skeleton due to AIDS. The whole world turned its back in fear, but Paul only felt pity. He remembered Rock once saying a sentence full of bitterness. "I have two lives, one for show and one for living, but I've never lived either completely." Paul Newman sighed, his heavy breath blending into the quiet space. Rock Hudson died to let the world know about the devastation of prejudice and the disease of the century. He was a giant, but locked in a cramped cage of expectations. Paul closed his eyes, silently hoping that in the other world, Rock could finally shed the elegant suit, shed that fake name to be himself, an ordinary Roy Scherer, allowed to love whom he wanted without needing to play any more roles. Anthony Perkins, the killer, Norman Bates in The Fear of Women. The rain outside the Connecticut farm began to intensify, the sound of water beating against the glass pane rapidly, like the erratic heartbeat of a panicked person. That sound pulled Paul Newman away from the sadness about Rock Hudson to face another figure, a slender man with a mysterious smirk who sowed terrifying obsession for millions of viewers, but lived his whole life in his own fear. That was Anthony Perkins, or Tony, the boy who let the role of Norman Bates in Psycho consume his soul. Paul remembered the early days meeting Tony in New York. Back then, Tony wasn't the insane killer on screen, but a young man with a scholarly appearance, bright eyes, and a sensitivity that bordered on fragile. But Paul, with the instinct of a veteran actor, always felt there was something unstable about Tony. He was like a string always stretched too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Tony was always jittery, easily startled, and seemed never to feel comfortable in his own body. In the flickering firelight, Paul remembered the rumors buzzing in Hollywood in the 50s. Tony was afraid of women. That fear wasn't the shyness of an adolescent boy, but a deep psychological obsession. To hide it, Tony had to undergo harsh psychological therapies of that time, trying to cure his sexual orientation to become a normal man in the public eye. Paul once saw Tony sitting alone in a corner of a coffee shop, hands trembling holding a cigarette, eyes avoiding all contact. He was running away from his own ego, a tired and hopeless escape. The peak of the tragedy was when Alfred Hitchcock saw that instability and brought it to the big screen. Paul believed Hitchcock chose Tony not just for his acting talent, but because he saw through to the demon suppressed inside him. When Psycho was released in 1960, the whole world shuddered at Norman Bates. But to Paul, the scariest thing wasn't the murder scene in the shower, but Tony's eyes at the end of the film. That wasn't acting. That was the ultimate loneliness of a man stripped of the right to be loved and accepted. Tony had worn the Norman Bates mask for too long, to the point it stuck to his flesh, making him unable to distinguish between real life and movies. Paul sighed, recalling Tony's final years. Although Tony later married Barry Berenson and had children, the ghost of the past never let him go. AIDS came as a cruel full stop in 1992, taking Tony's life in silence, completely contrary to the terrifying scream he created on the silver screen. Tony departed, carrying the secret of tormenting gay romances, of long nights of agony because he couldn't live his truth. Paul Newman looked out at the white curtain of rain, feeling a cold draft run down his spine. Anthony Perkins didn't kill anyone. He was just a victim of himself and of a society that never allowed different souls to exist in peace. The rain kept falling, sounding like the creeping footsteps of Norman Bates returning to the desolate house on the hill of memory, and where Tony remains forever imprisoned in that fateful role. Tab Hunter, the Dream Prince, and the Forbidden Love. The heavy rain falling outside the window of the Connecticut farm seemed to have soothed some of the tension in the room, but it stirred up in Paul Newman a vague sadness about beautiful but unfinished romances. From the haunting image of Anthony Perkins, Paul's memory drifted to a completely opposite extreme, a man radiant as the sun, with golden hair and a smile that made millions of teenage girls swoon. That was Tab Hunter, America's dream prince, and also the most painful secret lover of Anthony Perkins. Paul recalled the 50s when Tab Hunter was the name that guaranteed every box office success. Tab possessed the perfect beauty of an athlete, muscular, healthy, and with innocent blue eyes. Studios competed to promote Tab as the symbol of standard masculinity, a wholesome hero contrasting with the rebellion of James Dean or the darkness of Marlon Brando. But Paul, with the sensitivity of an insider, soon realized the clumsy play Hollywood was staging. He often saw Tab appear at movie premieres with famous starlets like Natalie Wood, hand in hand laughing and talking before the cameras. But when the flashbulbs went out, that smile also extinguished. giving way to an exhausted weariness. What tormented Paul the most was the secret affair between Tab Hunter and Anthony Perkins. They were two perfect halves of one heart, Tab radiant and extroverted, while Tony was quiet and introverted. Paul had caught them stealing glances at each other at noisy parties, eyes containing a whole sky of longing, but separated by the invisible wall of prejudice. While the press spun romantic stories between Tab and female stars, in reality, the heart of that boy next door only beat wildly when he was with Tony in closed hotel rooms where they could shed the star mask to be themselves. But Hollywood is a cruel stepmother. Paul shuddered, recalling the shocking event of 1955 when Confidential magazine exposed that Tab had been arrested for attending a gay party. It was a fatal blow, a cruel betrayal allegedly orchestrated by Agent Henry Wilson himself to distract public opinion from Rock Hudson, the studio's bigger cash cow. Tab was thrown into the tiger's den to save someone else. Paul remembered Tab's bewildered face back then. America's golden boy suddenly became a sinner, so turned away by studios and scorned by audiences. More painful than the collapsed career was the disintegration of love. Under terrible pressure from Paramount, Anthony Perkins was forced to choose his career over his feelings. Paul witnessed Tab's ultimate loneliness when abandoned by the person he loved most to chase fame. Tab once said a bitterly poignant sentence that Paul never forgot. "I was never allowed to be me. I was just a thoroughly packaged product." Paul Newman shifted slightly in the armchair, feeling a rare bit of comfort amidst the stream of tragic memories. Because unlike James Dean or Monty Clift, Tab Hunter didn't choose death. He chose to survive. Tab bravely left the fake aura, went to Europe to film spaghetti westerns, and found true happiness with his life partner, Alan Glazer, for decades after. When in this stormy night, Paul smiled with relief. At least on the list of his ill-fated friends, Tab was the only one who defeated Hollywood's cruel destiny to find peace at the end of his life. Sal Mineo, the unjust death of the one who dared to live true. The rain outside the Connecticut farm showed no sign of letting up. The heavy drops competed to lash against the glass, creating a ceaseless rattling sound, like the applause of an invisible audience praising the tragedies Paul Newman had just recalled. In the dim light of the night lamp, Paul closed his eyes, letting memory lead the way back to a dark alley in West Hollywood in the mid-70s. There, a young man with innocent, wide-round eyes and a baby face had fallen in a pool of blood, ending the life of the most pitiable rebel in cinematic history, Sal Mineo. Paul recalled the first time seeing Sal on the big screen in the movie Rebel Without a Cause. At that time, Sal was just a tiny teenager standing next to the giant James Dean. But Paul, with the sensitivity of an artist, saw a strange attraction in Sal. He played Plato, a lonely boy, craving affection and always looking at James Dean's character with eyes full of worship mixed with love. Paul understood that Sal wasn't acting. That look was real. Sal Mineo was the first person in Hollywood who dared to bring his true heart before the lens, dared to show vulnerability and the desire to be loved by another man, even if only under the guise of a character. But that courage cost Sal too high a price. Paul sighed, a heavy wheezing breath. He remembered the years after James Dean passed away. Sal's career also slid downhill without breaks. Hollywood back then was very cruel. They only needed Sal when he was babyface and the obedient little brother. But when Sal grew up, when he began to openly admit he was bisexual in the late 60s, an act Paul considered career suicide, studio doors slammed in his face. Sal went from an Oscar-nominated star to an outcast, struggling to find sporadic small roles on the theater stage to make a living. The most horrific memory struck Paul on the night of February 12, 1976. The news of Sal Mineo's death spread as fast as a poisonous wind. He was stabbed to death right in the garage behind his apartment when he had just returned home after a play rehearsal. Paul remembered slamming his fist on the table when listening to the police and press spin malicious theories. They claimed it was a lover's quarrel, a case related to drugs or shady gay relationships. No one believed Sal was an innocent victim. Social prejudice killed Sal's honor even when he had already fallen. It took many years for the truth to be exposed. Sal was killed by a drug-addicted pizza delivery man in a random robbery homicide. No romance, no drugs, just meaningless brutality. Paul stared into the dark void in front of him, feeling a surge of pity. Sal Mineo was the bravest among them. He was the first to step out of the shadows to live truthfully, but died alone in a cold alley, with no one by his side to protect him as the character Plato had once longed for. The rain outside seemed to also be weeping for the fate of the rebel boy. Sal lived his whole life looking for a shoulder to lean on, but in the end received the cold blade of destiny. Paul Newman whispered a belated apology, apologizing because his generation was not tolerant enough to shelter a soul so sensitive and sincere. Tyrone Power, the gallant Zorro and the double life. The rain falling outside had shifted to a steady, slower rhythm, like the ticking of an antique clock counting down the final moments. Paul Newman turned slightly, feeling a dull ache running down his spine. But that physical pain was nothing compared to the burden of memory pressing on his chest. From the tragedies of the younger generation, like Sal Mineo or Anthony Perkins, Paul's mind drifted back to the further past, to a brilliant but fake golden age, the domain of a god he once admired and pitied, Tyrone Power. In the dim light of the night lamp, Paul recalled the first time he saw Tyrone, or Ty as everyone usually called him, in the flesh. It was the embodiment of perfection. Ty possessed classic beauty, gallant and elegant, with a meticulously trimmed mustache and deep black eyes that could drown anyone. Ty was Zorro, the romantic knight, the dream of every American woman in the 40s and 50s. Paul, then just an actor new to the profession, looked at Ty as an intouchable monument. But then, right in those discreet dressing rooms, those private parties where wine flowed over the brim, Paul saw the crack in that statue. Ty lived a life torn in two. By day, he was the most masculine man in Hollywood, the husband of beautiful starlets. But when night fell, Ty sought comfort in the arms of young men, from waiters to anonymous sailors. Paul remembered the whispers in the industry about secret parties in Hollywood Hills, where Ty could shed the heavy knight's armor to live true to his desires. Ty wasn't as brave as Marlon Brando, nor as rebellious as James Dean. Ty belonged to the old generation, the generation that believed secrets were things that must be taken to the grave, and reputation was more important than personal happiness. Paul shuddered remembering Ty's dramatic death, a death he considered the most symbolic of the cruelty of the acting profession. It was November 1958 in freezing Madrid. Ty was filming Solomon and Sheba. He had to perform a fierce fencing scene with co-star George Sanders. Paul heard that Ty was very tired, his face pale under a thick layer of makeup, sweating profusely even though it was cold. Ty tried his best to swing the sword, or to maintain the image of the invincible hero one last time. But Ty's heart couldn't take it anymore. Right after the director yelled, "Cut!" Ty staggered and collapsed, hands still gripping the prop sword. He whispered to the assistant who ran over in panic, "I feel so cold, help me." Those were the last words of a legend. Ty died on the way to the hospital, still wearing the magnificent costume of King Solomon. He departed at the age of 44, the prime age of a man, but his heart had aged because it had to beat to a fake rhythm for so many years. Paul Newman looked pensively at the ashes in the fireplace. Tyrone Power died the way he lived, beautiful, glamorous, and tragic right on the stage of life. Ty taught Paul a painful lesson that the more beautiful the mask, the more terrible its weight. In this rainy night, Paul seemed to still see Ty's silhouette in the Zorro suit, smiling sadly, as if wanting to say that the price of perfection is sometimes one's own life. Cary Grant, 12 years of secret living with Randolph Scott. The rain outside had subsided, leaving only the sound of water dripping steadily from the eaves onto the damp ground, creating a quiet melody of the late night. Paul Newman leaned his head back against the chair, feeling fatigue invading every cell, but he knew he couldn't stop. He had to tell the final story about the greatest, most perfect man, the one the whole world worshipped as the gentleman of gentlemen, Cary Grant. If Tyrone Power was Zorro, then Cary Grant was a living work of art. Paul recalled the times meeting Cary at high-class parties. One Cary always appeared in a perfectly tailored suit without a single wrinkle, hair slicked back, and a mesmerizing half-smile. Women craved to fall into his arms, and men craved to become him. But Paul, with blue eyes that had seen through so many truths, always felt there was an invisible distance between Cary Grant, as the movie star, and the man standing in front of him. Because deep inside that glamorous shell was still Archie Leach, the poor boy from Bristol who always carried within him insecurity and a craving to be truly loved. And that love, according to what Paul had witnessed and sensed, did not lie with the starlet wives the studio set him up with, but lay in a house on the Santa Monica coast. Had it nicknamed Bachelor Hall, Paul recalled photos and friends' accounts of the cohabitation lasting 12 years between Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, the handsome cowboy of the silver screen. They lived together, ate dinner together by candlelight, took playful photos by the pool with radiant smiles and happy eyes that Cary rarely had when standing next to female co-stars. That wasn't a simple friendship of two grown men. That was a home. Paul believed that was the only time in his life Archie Leach was allowed to take off the tight suit of Cary Grant to live peacefully with the person he cherished. But Hollywood in the 30s and 40s did not accept such a perfect couple. The studio moguls issued an ultimatum, forcing them to separate and get married to quell rumors. Paul shuddered thinking of the conflict in Cary's heart, and he had to go through a series of failed marriages, noisy divorces, and even turned to LSD therapy in later years to try to find the self that had been lost. Cary once said a sentence that Paul remembered forever, both humorous and bitter. "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant." That sentence was the most painful confession. Cary Grant was a role that Archie Leach had to play his entire life, with no days off. Randolph Scott later also married, and the dreamlike love story at Bachelor Hall sank into the past, becoming a whispered legend at private parties. Paul Newman closed his heavy eyes. The fire in the fireplace had gone out completely, leaving only cold ashes. He had finished telling the stories. From the rebellious James Dean to the gallant Cary Grant, they all lived, loved, and suffered in the shadow of the aura. Paul felt unburdened, as if he had just cast off a 1,000-pound rock. Now he could peacefully drift into sleep, hoping that on the other side of life, where there are no stage lights and prejudices, Cary and Randolph are sitting together watching the sea, and James Dean is smiling and waving at him. Tonight, the secrets of Hollywood will sleep peacefully with Paul Newman. Among the 9 tragic private life stories we have just walked through, whose situation makes you feel the most haunted and sympathetic? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and pay tribute to these legends. If you find this story brings a humane and deep perspective on the dark corners of Hollywood, don't forget to give the video a like, click subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Your support is the motivation for us to continue opening the next secret files. Thank you for listening, and see you again in the next stories.